US and Japan are holding talks in Washington, D.C., which are expected to discuss ways to strengthen their security alliance amid heightened tensions on the Korean Peninsula. Will the talks make things better or worse? And China's top copyright monitoring center finds that the US is the top haven for online copyright infringement. How has it come about? Welcome to The Point. Live from Beijing, I'm Li Xin. U.S. Secretary of State Rex Tillerson and Secretary of Defense James Mattis on Thursday hosted their Japanese counterparts in Washington, D.C. for a Security Consultative Committee meeting, or the so-called 2+2 meeting. The two sides are expected to discuss ways to strengthen missile defense and other emergency response capabilities of the U.S.-Japan alliance amid heightened tensions over the DPRK. Days before the talks, Japan deployed several land-based missile interceptors at its self-defense forces bases, and its defense minister Itsunori Onodera said he would consider the option of allowing the self-defense forces to directly attack the DPRK's missile bases. Will such actions be helpful in easing tensions on the peninsula? And will the guidelines for Japan-US defense cooperation be strengthened to strengthen their alliance? Joining the discussion today from Washington, D.C. is Douglas Smith, former Assistant Secretary at the U.S. Department of Homeland Security. Mr. Smith, thank you very much for joining us, as usual. Among other issues, the DPRK's nuclear and missile threat is obviously at the top of the agenda for the so-called 2+2 meeting. Last week, Japanese Defense Minister Onodera said Tokyo would continue to cooperate closely with Washington, D.C. and Seoul to rein in the DPRK's provocations, while also asking China and Russia to play bigger roles on this issue. So what kind of joint actions could the two sides take to push China and Russia into playing bigger roles?
Well, I think the most interesting thing to watch is actually sort of breaking news from your side as we speak. Currently, the chairman of our Joint Chiefs of Staff, General Dunford, is in Beijing, met with President Jinping, met with his counterpart with the People's Liberation Army, specifically to discuss the escalation of tensions within North Korea. General Dunford will leave Beijing and fly to Tokyo to then continue those discussions. I think back here in the United States, President Trump has taken one position, but as recently as yesterday, his chief strategist came out and completely shot down the notion of a military solution in North Korea. So I think we are seeing a rapidly evolving story.
Yeah.
I think the Japanese Prime Minister and the Japanese Minister of Defense are in a really delicate dance right now as they look to cues from both Beijing and Washington as to how they're going to play out, while at the same time looking out for the self-interests of the Japanese people.
Yeah.
I mean, it's a very tense situation. The question will be, will they be able to walk it back a little bit further and get back to the negotiating table, and everyone can sort of go to their corners while they reestablish?
Well, by coming closer militarily and in cooperation, do you think the U.S. and Japan could push the DPRK further away from the negotiating table?
I think that's a real risk, and I think a great sign is General Dunford, the chairman of our Joint Chiefs of Staff, is a very, very smart and highly qualified military officer, and the fact that he is on the ground in Beijing, heading shortly to Tokyo, is a very good thing. I think if they're able to get the militaries talking, get people to take a step back and allow diplomacy to once again come forward, will be a powerful message. I don't think the last people that want to see a military solution are the people of South Korea, because they will be the people that will be most immediately impacted. At the same time, I do know that the Japanese, they need to protect their own people, and they're watching what's happening. They're watching some of the rogue actions coming out of North Korea, and they want to be prepared. But I do think they are carefully watching this dance between the U.S. military and the Chinese military, and seeing if they can't help exert some pressure upon North Korea to dial it back a notch.
Now, newly appointed Japanese Defense Minister Onodera has said he will consider the option of allowing the self-defense forces to acquire the ability to directly attack the DPRK's missile bases amid escalating tensions over Pyongyang's weapons program. But acts of belligerence are banned by Article 9 of the Japanese Constitution. Do you think, observing from your side, that Japan has been taking advantage of the tension on the peninsula to legitimize its military expansion?
No, to me, sorry about that. Yeah, I think a little bit. I mean, I think they have been playing a very delicate dance since President Trump came into office, given the rhetoric that President Trump had on the campaign when he was running for president. And I think now, particularly given the political headwinds that President Trump is facing at home, the Prime Minister is having to, and the Minister of Defense of Japan are having to real time adjust their game plan. And I don't think that they've been looking for an excuse to escalate their military posturing. I mean, it costs a lot of money to build up one's military. So I think what they're doing is just looking out for Japan's self-interest. I mean, they have a very unstable leader in North Korea, and as a result, they're trying to walk a very delicate line while they see what Beijing, what Washington does to try to put him back in his box.
Yeah, well, I'm afraid that's not the opinion shared by many people here in China, for instance, because what Japan has been doing is to fan up the kind of risks that, or the security risk that people here on the in Northeast Asia are faced with, so that Japan will have a legitimate excuse to step up its military capacity building. Let's hear the opinion from our next guest, who is Professor Victor Yi-Leung-Tie. He's an assistant professor in the Department of Japanese Studies at the University of Hong Kong. Professor Tail, thank you very much for joining us. What is your take on what Japan has been doing ever since the tension has been ratcheting up on the Korean Peninsula? Is Japan legitimate in expanding, in building up its military capacity faced with all of these tensions under its pacifist constitution?
Well, I think for sure Japan has a legitimate reason right now to rethink its foreign policy positions. But this is not something new. This has been actually in place since I think I would say since the mid-1990s, when the North Koreans have actually gone and embarked on their missile and nuclear program. But because of the escalated situation on the Korean Peninsula, we are definitely seeing both sides, both the Japanese and the North Koreans, and as well as the Americans, ratcheting up tensions. So if you ask me whether this is a legitimate move on part of the Japanese, I would say of course it is.
Well, but it has a pacifist constitution which, specifically bans its military to, for instance, actively engage in military operations overseas. And now we're hearing the Japanese defense minister talking about directly striking the DPRK's military bases. It just doesn't add together.
Well, I understand your concerns, and I think this is the concerns of many countries in Asia. But right now, this is the discussions that the Japanese are involved with the Americans these couple of days has to do with preemptive measures, meaning they would like to consider taking out the North Korean missile sites, for example, before the North Koreans will have a chance to launch this. But I think we have to contextualize this. This is all rhetoric and discussion. Whether the Japanese are able to do it, to pass the relevant laws to actually follow up on this, and whether the Americans will actually let the Japanese have the trigger control, separate matters. So I think at this time it is just talk.
Of course, at this moment it is
good news, because
sure.
Over the last.
Of course, it is just rhetoric at this moment, and basically it has been, the tension has been built on hot air, and the more two sides trade, these kind of heated rhetorics, the more the DPRK will be, how should you say, propelled to go further on their nuclear program, whereas Japan has also been, taking steps, and these steps sometimes are irreversible. For instance, I wonder, as Japan on Saturday deployed some of its land-based missile interceptors known as the Aegis at its self-defense forces bases, over which any DPRK missiles would likely to fly en route to Guam. How effective would these interceptors be in stopping the DPRK's missiles, and are these deployments likely to become permanent, Professor Till?
Well, I think the Japanese and the Americans have been testing various systems. I know they have a land-based system, and then they have a sea-based system. And so far, according to at least the sources, various sources that has reported on the Japanese and the American missile intercept systems, they have actually worked a large amount of time. In fact, I think it was yesterday or the day before that I just read a Heritage Council report that so far the tests have been very successful. Now, the question as to whether the North Koreans will actually fire the missiles at the American bases is a moot one. I personally do not think or do not believe that the North Korean leader is an unstable or irrational person. In fact, I think he is very rational, very calculative, and he knows precisely what he's doing. So over the course of the last few days, there have been, there have been threats and acrimonies across the board, but at the same time, there have been signals. For instance, I think today the Straits Times reported that the North Korean foreign minister was actually trying to get the Japanese foreign minister, at least communicate to the Japanese foreign minister that the North Koreans would actually like to speak or have a dialogue with the Japanese. Mm-hmm. And earlier today, I think President Donald Trump was actually tweeted about that the North Korean leader is actually a wise person to rethink his plans to in his words, to shoot his missiles at Guam. So I think there are signs for de-escalation. So
yeah, why did they, ratchet it up in the first place? I mean, the whole world is wasting time and saliva following these, these rhetorics. I'm really getting a little bit tired. But Mr. Smith, let me come to you. Really, what is your take on all of this? It's a big circle, and again, we're coming back to where we were.
No, absolutely, and look.
Yes, I think a lot of these.
Mr. Smith first. Yeah, Mr. Smith first.
Absolutely. It's been a discussion since the halt of hostilities of the Korean War. The challenge is, and all of this is, the people of South Korea. The U.S. has some very, very powerful capabilities and some powerful first strike capabilities, and would potentially have tremendous success in knocking down missiles, taking out ballistic missile sites. But the great unknown is along the North and South Korean border are thousands of pieces of artillery. And that artillery will be able to launch. And that's sort of the great wild card in all this. I think you're absolutely right. The rhetoric between the leader of North Korea and President Trump has done nothing but make the matters worse. I mean, we have two, in my belief, unstable people in these positions, and they are both pumping up their chests and creating a real challenge for the President of China, the Prime Minister of Japan, the leaders of South Korea to have to deal with. And I think what we're going to have to see is some cooler heads prevail. As I said at the beginning of this, I think it's a very helpful situation that the head of our military is in direct talks in Beijing. We'll be flying to Tokyo to have talks, because I think with cooler heads prevailing, we can walk this back and find a better solution where both leaders of North Korea and the United States can save some face in this situation.
Hopefully. Thank you very much. We have to go. Many thanks, Douglas Smith, former Assistant Secretary at the U.S. Department of Homeland Security, and Professor Victor Till, an Assistant Professor in the Department of Japanese Studies at the University of Hong Kong. And here is my first point. There are some who fear that Japan will use this opportunity under the name of protecting itself by shooting down missiles fired from the DPRK to slowly move away from its pacifist constitution, which was brought in after the Second World War. And that worry is now greater after Japan's defense minister said he would consider allowing the self-defense forces to directly attack the DPRK's missile bases. The question therefore remains whether Japan will dismantle these land-based missile interceptors once the current tensions have been reduced. I have to say I personally have my doubts. Let's hope I'm proved wrong. And you've been watching The Point with me, Liu Xin. We'll take a short break and we'll be back right after this.
CGTN shows you more, providing a fresh global voice you can trust.
And a different look at the world you won't find anywhere else.
We offer unparalleled coverage of Asia, Africa, and Latin America.
We present diverse perspectives on news and newsmakers from around the world.
We want to engage our viewers with stories that represent the complete picture.
We want to share with you ideas that matter to us all.
The stories, the people, the issues.
A new and balanced perspective.
CGTN. See the difference.
The United States has become top haven for stealing intellectual property right. The latest data from China's top monitoring center, the Copyright Society of China Monitoring Center, shows among the 8,000 infringing works this July, 45% of the piracy domain name servers are located in the US, the highest in the world. What does this mean? What has China done to prevent copyright infringement? I'm pleased to be joined on the phone by Mr. Wu Guanyong, he's Vice Director of the Copyright Society of China Monitoring Center. Mr. Wu, thank you very much for joining us. Explain to us, what are these infringing works we're talking about, and how was this data collected and the analysis carried out?
Okay, the infringing works are popular theatrical titles and hot TV series, both from Chinese and overseas, like The Wolf Warrior 2, A Game of Thrones Season 7, and such as Hollywood films, etc. And the 12426 Copyright Society of China Monitoring Center is dedicated to creating a more healthy and a more transparent environment of copyright industry. We have built the world-leading copyright big data platform. We crawl the web to find the suspicious websites and use audiovisual content recognition search engine software to determine whether they indeed contain infringing content. We then find the IP address of infringing sites and determine the countries they belong to.
So, yeah. So is this the first time such analysis has been carried out by your center? If not, how has the trend been in the past?
Actually, we have been doing similar analysis since 2011. And back then, honestly, more than 50% of infringing links sites are hosted in mainland China, such as Weibo and VeriCD, etc. And at that time, still has the famous sites like the Pirate Bay in Europe. And nowadays, we find more and more sites are hosted in overseas, especially in the United States.
What is China's standing at this particular moment?
At nowadays, it's still about 40% in China.
Yeah, but that's much lower than the 50% in 2011. Finally, some might say this number looks too high, as many servers are based are thought to be based in third world countries, although the domain might have been registered in the United States. How could you explain this? How credible is this number?
Actually, we use industrial standard methods like such as whois to determine the countries hosting each website. The numbers should be quite accurate according to our tests, and for our right holders and that for the platforms, they are quite accurate, I think.
Okay, many thanks to Mr. Wu Guanyong, Vice Director of the Copyright Society of China Monitoring Center. And for more analysis, we are pleased to be joined from Taipei by Mr. He Jing, an attorney at Anjie Law Firm, and in Shanghai by Professor Shi Xiaoxiang, an assistant professor of intellectual property of East China University of Political Science and Law. Welcome, gentlemen, to both of you. Mr. He, from what we have heard just now, does it mean that there are a lot of loopholes in the international copyright infringement law or supervision system?
Well, I think it's more complicated than saying that whether there's a loopholes or not. Obviously, there are lots of challenges. I would say that this is really shows that how complicated it is in the global times. Nowadays, that the online piracy it's really a big challenge. You know, infringers place content all over the world. You know, could be in China, could be in the United States, and it could be somewhere else. It really depends on where they can really operate from. The truth is that, or the challenge is that it's very hard to trace or track the pirates. It's much harder. Okay, what's really happened is that whenever the content owner and identify a pirated feed, and they really need to do something quickly and then make the notice, the takedown notice to what we call ISP, Internet Service Provider. For example, right now I'm in Taipei. You know, I'm here for the University 8. Let's say it is very popular, the finals for basketball game. Mm-hmm. The university student and family want to watch it. You know what's happening in Taipei, and someone do the illegal live streaming and then host the content in the US or Taipei or Hong Kong servers, then really up to the right holders to do something quickly. But it's not that easy.
No,
okay?
no.
It's really not
how
that
do
easy.
you,
You really
however,
need
how
to
do
take
you,
lots of technologies to do this.
Sure. How do you look at the possible reasons behind the increase in percentage of such servers being located in the United States and in Europe, Mr. He?
Okay, that's very interesting actually. I actually take that it's probably because the Chinese content owners or even the licensees who are given the rights to enforce have done good job in China, which is true actually. You know, from what we know, also the Chinese government, also the Chinese right holders has been really aggressively going after the online piracy in China these days. It used to be the case that a lot of contents probably were hosted in China servers, but because of the governments really taking down lots of the problems in response to the complaints from content owners, and then some of the pirates are moving the content over to some other servers. Let's, assuming that all the data are accurate, I take that is because probably the bandwidth in the US is better, and another reason is our content owners based in China and have not started very aggressive enforcement actions in the US. Okay, it's going to take something. It's going to take more resources.
Sure.
They are going to. They need.
Yeah, Professor Shi, tell me what is your interpretation of this data and the trend that we have observed of the increase actually of these servers being located in the United States and in Europe, and the decrease in China?
Well, to me, I don't think that's surprising at all because the US has a very big market share in the web hosting, online data storage, and cloud computing services. And it's, the DNS indication means that those illegal contents are stored in the US. The servers are located in the US. There might be a few reasons. Number one, they have a very strong market power. And number two, this market is less regulated in the US. For instance, in China, internet service providers are highly regulated. It's not that easy for a company to host a website or providing hosting services in China without regulation, without monitoring. But in the US, there are more service providers in this area. And there's another reason is that the copyright system in the US provides for a kind of safe harbor for those kind of service providers. If those contents on the internet are uploaded by the internet users, usually the service providers will not be held liable for copyright infringements.
Yeah. Well, the Chinese monitoring agency, also says that some websites are even exploring ways to transmit pirated resources through satellites in low orbit, which pose greater challenge, or even for protecting intellectual property rights. How can we better counter these challenges, Professor Shi?
Yeah, of course, new technology would always bring new challenges to copyright enforcement. If the infringers are going to use satellites to transmit illegal contents peer-to-peer, not from a website to the public, and it will be quite difficult for the governments or for law enforcement bodies to monitor the transferring of the contents. If this transmission is not part of the internet transmission, it will be very, very difficult. I think it is almost impossible for even not just for the governments, but also for individual copyright owners to fight against this kind of illegal transmission.
Yeah, Mr. He, how do you look at the additional challenges regulators and law enforcement agencies are faced with in fighting online piracy at this particular age?
I think the particular challenge we really need to resolve is dedicated resources. You know, China has invested huge in the anti-piracy and anti-counterfeiting campaign. But what we really need is a dedicated team. It is true that we have criminal enforcement, we have a police that are available to do this job. But ultimately, if you're looking at the international experience, whether it's the US or some other countries or other regions, you really need eventually a police force dedicated to deal with the piracy and counterfeiting. So they have their own mandates. They do not need to be snuck under some other kind of a police force. And we really need to have the dedicated the police team with the best technology resources to react to that.
On top of what
would be really encourage the current owner to deal with it.
Yeah, on top of what they have already been doing. Very briefly, Professor Shi, now Chinese president, on a larger picture, Chinese president Xi has set a three-pronged target for China to become a leader in science and technology. He said China should establish itself as one of the most innovative countries by 2020, a leading innovator by 2030, and a global science and technology leader by 2049. Is China on track?
Well,
I would say so.
I'm not an expert.
Professor Shi, Professor Shi, please.
China's protecting the IP. You know, we
Professor Shi, please. Yeah.
Okay, I'm not. Well, yeah. Thank you. Well, I'm not an expert in technology, but I'm pretty sure that China's intellectual property law has been ready for the new challenges, and the legal system can provide better environments for innovation. For instance, our patent law being revised in 2008, and the most amendments is on the way very soon. And our copyright law is on amendments. Our trademark law is quite good, actually. So our IP system is definitely get ready for the new future.
Yeah, thank you very much, gentlemen. We have to leave it there. Mr. He Jing, an attorney at Angie Law Firm, and Professor Shi from the East China University of Political Science and Law. And very briefly, my last point, a statistic show by the end of 2016, there are over 730 million internet users in China. So the entire online copyright industry was valued at over $80 billion, an increase of 30%. So the challenges is really big. However, I think the effort is also clearly paying off, as it is increasingly difficult and risky to download any pirated content on the internet here in China. So that's it for this edition of The Point with me, Liu Xin. Thank you very much for joining us. As always, follow us on Twitter or on Facebook using The Point with LX, the handle. Download the application CGTN Live or go to YouTube and look for CGTN The Point. Thanks for watching. You've got The Point.